recently Leslie Kane, New York Times writer John Burroughs, who was at Revilution Forest. Chris didn't like the fact that I asked Larry Warren about the John Lennon photograph, a question that Nick Pope, the media investigator, asked you to ask him, and also questions about his lie detector test, polygraph test. Chris didn't like those things, had a lot of other things to say. The only thing I can say is that the guests that I do are to fit in with the format of this program. We give you people who sometimes you won't get to hear anywhere else. And sometimes there'll be mainstream scientists with very interesting views. The last show, of course, from the National Physical Laboratory, I was talking with people who are at the very cutting edge of science. The show before, a lot of people really didn't like. Callista, the woman who believes that unicorns are real and they have power. I got emails from people saying, well done for having Callista on. She's marvelous, we want to hear more of her. And I got emails saying, why have you put that woman on your show? Well, I guess there is a thing called free speech, and it's very much at the core of the United States democracy and ours here in the UK. I'm not saying that I'm part of the democratic process here, by the way, but what I am saying is that we have the right to express our opinions, and don't we have the responsibility to listen to other people's opinions, even if we think they're nuts? Because from that we might learn something. And if we start suppressing people's opinions, not allowing certain books to be read, not allowing certain things to be said, I think we're in a real bad place. And I think some of that, and I'm seeing more and more of this, is driven by social media, where groups of people get together and suddenly a view forms. And anybody who doesn't have that same view, they better look out. That's a worry, because we know what starts from that. Now that's all a million miles from a little show called The Unexplained, I know that. But I've always believed that people have a right to put their point, and we learn by listening to them, even if we think they're completely wrong. Personally, and I said it in the show, I have seen nothing to make me believe at any stage in my life that unicorns are a real thing. I did make that very clear, and Callista told me why that was not so. Now you might disagree with that, but surely neither of us can disagree with her right to express her view. And I found it a very interesting conversation. And I liked her as a person. But I still don't believe in unicorns, but that's a matter for me and for many of you. Last edition was about pure science, so a lot of people like that, and we'll do a little bit more of taking the show out and doing shows in different places. This edition is about one of the most controversial subjects there is. Maybe the most controversial subject. And before I tell you what it is, let me just say this. That of course we don't advocate people who put forward views that advocate law-breaking or harming people, anything like that. That is not what I've just argued for. Let me just, before anybody emails to say that. Okay, let's get to the subject on this edition. Deeply controversial. The flat Earth. Now you might have thought that question was settled hundreds of years ago. Maybe even before that. And I certainly thought that it was game, set and match. We are a globe. We've seen it from space. But increasingly getting traction are the views of people who think that the Earth is completely flat, and they have what they think are scientific reasons for believing that, and they think that we have been told a lie. The king of these people, maybe, the man who is most often quoted by emailers to my show is a guy called Mark Sargent. And I've had emails saying, please don't put Mark Sargent on your show, and emails saying, you've got a show called The Unexplained, you've never had Mark Sargent on, why not? That's the way it splits. So I'm going there in this edition, and I think it's going to be interesting. I personally believe that the Earth that we live on is an oblate spheroid. It is a globe. That's what I was taught in school. That's what I saw when I was a kid watching the Apollo missions. Mark Sargent is going to try and persuade me, and maybe you otherwise, and I think he will be interesting. Thanks very much for being in touch with my show. Thank you for liking it if you have. Please keep the faith with me. All right, let's get to the US, and the guest on this edition, Mark Sargent, talking about the flat Earth. Mark, thank you for coming on.
And thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Mark, controversial, I guess, is a word that could be applied to you, and I'm sure you've heard that word used in relation to yourself on occasions. You know, you are the only guest in all the years that I've been doing this show, both on radio and online, where I've actually had almost equal numbers of people out of the blue emailing me saying, why haven't you had Mark Sargent on your show? If you've got a show called The Unexplained, you need Mark Sargent on there. And on the other hand, people emailing me out of the blue saying, whatever you do, don't talk with Mark Sargent and don't discuss Flat Earth. So it's a little weird, really, but, which just made me want to have you on here all the more, to be perfectly frank with you. I've heard and read over the last couple of years a lot about you. You tell me your story first then, Mark. What are you? What background do you come from?
I come from a software background, a tech background, a geek, nerd, dork type background. I initially started playing video games for a living back in the mid-90s. I won a video game tournament a long time ago and was hired for a company in Colorado, and it was a dream job, traveling around the country, going to expositions and playing games and hanging out with gamers. And when that company finally folded, I taught proprietary software to blue-collar factories. It was time and attendance software. It was timekeeping software for the better part of 20 years. And that's what I did. That was basically my background. Everything, every dorky thing you could ever think of a guy, doing, playing games with his friends and drinking wine and watching a lot of movies. That's what I did. And in some of my spare time, I got into conspiracies. And, the first conspiracy, I grew up in a very sheltered background on a little island north of Seattle called Whidbey, Whidbey. And that's where, and I because it was a real rural environment, I didn't believe in conspiracies. Heck, I didn't even believe really people lied at a high level. I didn't. I honestly, it's like, wow, why would people lie about anything?
Well, we've all come to see the truth about that one. I think we can probably agree on a lot of that.
Yeah.
So there you were, a guy who was technically inclined in a way that I haven't been over my lifetime, full of admiration for people like you who do that, living in a place that is very remote, not particularly inclined to believe conspiracy theories or even give them any truck. In a country like the United States, there are a million conspiracy theories and millions of people who believe in them because your country has free speech. And I personally think, and that's something else that I referred to in the introduction to this show, that's a good thing. What is it that tipped the balance then for you? What is it that made you want to start asking questions of that which we have been told as assured fact?
The JFK, the movie by, sorry, I got a frog caught in my throat. The movie, which was done by Oliver Stone in the early 90s. I saw it in the theater opening weekend. He did such a masterful job at mixing live footage with his own simulated footage that it was basically seamless. And the audience was engaged to where when people were walking out of that thing, they were really angry. People bought it. I mean, they absolutely said, "Oh yeah, if you really were invested in that movie, you walked out of there going, you know what? There was the lone gunman thing. You can throw that out the window." And that's what really kind of led me. Remember, the internet wasn't up and running yet. So once the internet, that's really what just exploded the conspiracy world over here in the States was the internet. And after that, I got into just about anything you would think of. I loved it. I loved mysteries. I loved anything that was unexplained. And then of course we had 9/11, but of course I had looked at other things besides JFK, like every major American war, Pearl Harbor, if you name every conspiracy that came up, I just digested it. But I wasn't like a tinfoil hat type of wearing guy. I just really enjoyed the stories. And that's what, and to the point where I think I was conspiracy bored by the time about 2014 rolled around. I'd seen it and done it all. And it's like, all right, well, there's no conspiracies left. And everybody that's into conspiracies, and I mean everybody, has heard of the flat Earth. We've all heard of it. Everyone laughs at it. It's the book on the shelf you're never going to read. It's the DVD you got for Christmas you're never going to watch because it's ridiculous. It's silly. It's very much one thing to buy into the theory that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was killed by whoever, but it certainly wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald acting on his own. I think much of America believes that. It's completely another thing to believe things like we didn't go to the moon or indeed the Earth is flat. They're very different. They challenge the nature of science. You're absolutely right. And a warning to the people that are out there: if you believe that the Americans went to the moon, that went not just once, but 6 times in the late 60s, early 70s with almost no technology, and nobody died, nobody got injured. and then they just shut down the program for no apparent reason back in 1972 and never been back since, and nobody's ever gone since, then Flat Earth is going to be a really, really hard sell for you, which is why one of the litmus tests we throw out to people is, do you believe in the moon landing? That's what I throw out, because you got to start somewhere, and that's a pretty good place to start. And honestly, I'm really surprised people in the give credit to the United States for throwing the propaganda out there that inside the United States, I absolutely understand, wave the flag, rah rah, of course we went to the moon, we're great, we're in the United States. Outside of here, though, I'm really surprised there wasn't more suspicion out of the gate, and because there's just a lot of inconsistencies. And for me, I always thought there was something wrong with the moon missions, but I couldn't put my finger on it, because I was like going, excuse me, I didn't believe it, but at the same time, I couldn't figure out a good enough reason why to fake it. It's like, why would the Americans even bother faking the thing? It's like, yeah, okay, wave the flag, we're number one, but is that it? That's all? It's an awful lot of money to spend for a little bit of false reputation.
But isn't one of the biggest arguments, and we'll get into the Flat Earth discussion because we have to, that's what this particular edition is about, but isn't one of the biggest arguments against we didn't go to the moon, that if we didn't go to the moon, then competitors in the space industry, the space race, that's China, that's the Russians, that's anyone else who's ever fired a rocket up there, maybe even including Kim Jong-un these days, but they will be the first to out you. They will be the first to say NASA is lying.
Well, there's a problem there, and that is, there's a bunch of different movie references I could give to it, but that is, let's say I had proof, absolute proof, document. Let's say I had an astronaut that on his deathbed told me everything and gave me photos and a taped testimony. Remember, I'm in the States. Who exactly do I go to get that information out there nowadays? I mean, you can't exactly go to mainstream media, because the producers, somebody's going to talk to somebody, and it's just not. There's too many corporations involved. Do I post it on Facebook? Because how long does that stay up? Do I post it on YouTube? What do I do? So anything that's coming from another country, let's say it's North Korea, or not necessarily Russia, but North Korea, or anyone that we consider an enemy. It's some country in the Middle East, supposedly. That story's never getting in here. It's going to be spun in a certain way, and it's just going to be discounted right away, as opposed to, like, let's say the Russians, who I believe were in on it since day one. That I have always believed that Russia and the United States at the highest levels have never really been enemies. They're just kind of posturing each other on the chessboard. Two tough guys in the end of each street, kind of giving each other a nod, and everyone's, oh yeah, these guys are going to rumble someday, and they never do. Yeah, it's for the troops, of course, they're taught to hate each other. We still, better dead than red, and the communist threat and blah blah blah. But I think at the highest level, and we can, if you want me, I can go into a story, but at the highest level, I think we've always been there for each other, and it's just posturing, and it's brilliant tactic in my opinion.
Well, a lot of money was expended to do it on both sides. I mean, for example, the Russians and the Americans both had separate space station programs for a while until it was realized that was way too expensive, so there was cooperation. But why would we waste all of this money, effort, and resources then telling people that we'd gone to the moon when in fact we hadn't? What would be the point of faking something like that? That is the point. That's the one thing I don't think I would ever get.
Think of it this way, because it's really only time and money. And you're saying, well, what's bigger than money? And it's like, well, keeping the society under control, and I don't want to steal too much from the Matrix here, but control is such an important thing. What I'm talking about, let's jump into the Flat Earth thing for a sec, which is, what I'm saying is, if this world isn't a ball spinning in space, this infinite little speck, just nothingness that can be snuffed out at any time in the vastness of space, but instead is this beautifully, wonderfully crafted, enclosed, pressurized system, a petri dish, a snow globe, a pizza box, whatever, I like the domed stadium personally, then you've got to really do some extreme things to keep it a secret. I mean, we didn't build it, obviously. With the builders are much more advanced than us and probably far, far older. But you can't let the general population know where they are, because they're not going to act naturally anymore. Meaning, if they found out, let's boil it down here, and I don't know, what your religious angle is, and I'm not going to preach chapter and verse or anything, but if this place was built, if there's actual proof that it was built, we were living in a building, then it was created. And if it was created, then somebody who's the creator. And at that point, you're giving the religious houses of this world, the big five, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, you're giving them an advantage that science has been scared of for a long, long time.
When you say an advantage, what do you mean by that?
Well, remember, science has been beating religion over the head for the last 500 years, building their institution of science. And I love the stuff, even though I preach the war on science, I love some of the stuff that science has brought us, light bulbs and air conditioning and microwave ovens and stuff like that. But they've also, in that process, has basically said that that there is no creator. It happened by accident, and that science is the new religion. And so all of a sudden to go back the other way after 500 years and say, oh yeah, by the way, it was built, which means all the foundations of science will be rocked to their core. Think of what would happen overnight if it was found out. And forget about just astrophysics and astronomy in every university in the world. Those would shut down overnight. But the remaining physical sciences like geology, hydrology, archaeology, take your pick, anyology, they all start with the same premise, which is, oh yeah, we're a globe flying through space.
Well, do they? I mean, they would still have a use, even if what you say is correct, and they still have had a use for centuries. They've been there,
but they would have to be retooled. And it would all happen. We're talking about not just talking about one retooling. We're talking about all of them. I mean, books would have to be, well, now of course it'd be text, but entire libraries would have to be scuttled and then rebuilt from the ground up. And we're talking about potentially a lot of chaos. And if there's one thing I have learned is that the powers that be, I like calling them the authority. If you want to put a name on a particular group, you can, but there's so many different groups at this point, that the authority doesn't like the potential of chaos. If they even suspect for a second that there'll be people running through the streets with pitchforks and torches, they're gonna keep that thing under wraps for as long as they can. So if they found out, and we're not talking about a secret that was known for a long time. We're talking about a secret they couldn't even prove, that that we're living in a structure. They couldn't even prove until the mid-1950s or late 1950s. I mean, up until then, really, until you had the tech to sort it out, meaning the internal combustion engine and pressurized planes and crap like that, what do you really know? If you say you're the king of France in 1400, someone says, oh yeah, here's the map of the world, it's flat and it's like a domed structure. What's he going to do? He's got wooden ships and horses. He's not going to do anything. So when the Americans and the Soviet Union figure it out during Operation Deep Freeze in 1956, what do? You sit down, you have that meeting, we talk about what we just talked about. It's like, oh, what could go wrong? And once you kind of figure that out, it's like, well, that's a short meeting, a short right. X-Files. Go ahead.
We have to make this really clear. I'm a big fan of that movie, The Truman Show. Jim Carrey did a great job on that show.
Oh, great.
It worked on so many levels. You are saying that everything is The Truman Show, and America and the US know it, and America and the Russians know it, and they worked this out 60, I'm just trying to work out the numbers, 62 years ago.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying the United States and the Soviet, I'm saying they were looking for it since the 1920s. The best thing I could come up with was that there's been a map out there, or a series of maps that showed what the world really looked like. And they've been around for a long, long time. But again, until you have the technology to actually do some serious exploring, you can't figure it out. So what happens is in 1928, they send our best guy, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, which was the youngest admiral in the United States Navy. He made admiral, I think, at 41, which is pretty amazing. They send him down to Antarctica, best living explorer of all. And he just goes down there and he's flying his own planes and doing his own missions. He goes year after year, he's doing his missions down there looking for something. And they're not talking about what he's looking for. And then World War II breaks out. Everybody leaves the ice except for one country, which was really an interesting little side story, which is Nazi Germany. They were the only ones down there during World War II, which is weird. World War II ends, Admiral Byrd immediately goes back down to Antarctica. As a matter of fact, he takes a full-blown carrier fleet with support ships called Operation High Jump. The rumor was that he was trying to root out the last of the Nazi bases, which was down in Antarctica. And then after that, he just kept doing more missions. And then in 1954, and you guys can look this up. This is secret information. You can just connect the dots yourself. 1954, he goes on an American television show called Longines Chronoscope. And it's kind of like the 60 Minutes of its day, 1954. And he's talking about the next mission, which is going to be Operation Deep Freeze in 1955, 1956. And he's saying that Antarctica, there's a whole bunch of countries down there, and it's full of resources. The place is basically made out of money. He's hyping up the corporations to go down there. He's saying there's oil, there's entire mountain range made out of coal, can supply everybody, there's uranium, there's minerals, all sorts of fun stuff. Then he goes down during Operation Deep Freeze in 55, 56. And whatever he found, and I have no doubt what he found, he found the outer marker, and it took him a long time to get there. It took him a better part of 30 years.
The outer marker?
The outer marker, meaning if this is a domed structure, eventually there's an end point, which is why you've got to hide it from the public, because people hate being enclosed. They hate confinement. And he found, no doubt in my mind, he found the outer barrier. Whatever you want to call it, the soft wall, whatever it's made out of, a heavy element, a heavy water, a frequency modulation, electromagnetics, who knows what it was.
Well, I've heard people who espouse the flat Earth theory say that the edge of the planet, the edge of the disk, is all ice. It's an ice wall all the way around. Is that what you believe?
That's just the first part of it. That's just the beginning of the edge. The edge is it's a good point you brought that up, because the edge, it's a misconception, which is people will immediately think that the edge, the Antarctic coastline is basically the edge of the Earth. It's like, no. That's just the beginning of the edge. Meaning, imagine putting a quarter on top of, like, say, a saucer, like a teacup saucer. How far out the edge of that quarter is from the edge of the saucer. That's what the sort of distances we're talking about here. Because when you get, Antarctica is the most unusual continent out of all the continents. When you get there, literally the beachfront is 150, 200 feet or higher of ice, straight up. Yeah, you could call it an ice wall, but it's just the beginning of the ice continent. And then, what else people don't know is, once you get on top of it, then it just starts sloping up really, really quickly to where the average elevation, and I can't do it in meters for you, but the average elevation of the whole continent is about 14,000 feet. That's a long, long way. I mean, altitude sickness kicks in at about 7,000 feet. So you've got that happening. And then, of course, there's no indigenous plant life, no indigenous animal life. There's no ancient civilizations or anything. I mean, the whole place just screams, go away. If the icebergs don't scare you away from the coastline, the actual plateau will scare you away.
Well, isn't that because we're on a globe, and it just so happens that the poles are places where, they're not in receipt of that much sunlight, and that's why they're cold?
Well, again, that's what science will tell you, and that science has had a long time to get this story out there. And don't forget that this place was designed to simulate a globe-type system. Meaning, no different than a planetarium, no different than the Truman Show. So, yeah, I mean, science can say whatever it wants, but at the same time, there's a lot of inconsistencies with the South Pole than opposed to the North Pole. Like, for example, flights go over the North Pole all day long. South Pole, they don't. GPS works absolutely fine around the northern hemisphere, if you believe in the northern hemisphere, but which is the inner disk of the flat Earth. But when you get out to the southern hemisphere, the GPS system is useless. That absolutely does nothing. There's 3 massive oceans down there where you cannot retract. Your plane goes into approximated mode or estimated mode, and the latitude and longitude cannot be tracked.
Isn't that just because the bulk of people and the bulk of usage is up north in the northern hemisphere? And what's the point of providing those facilities for a place where people tend not to go?
Yeah, it's a nice idea, except that the GPS system is DoD, and they've got redundancy built into everything they do. And we're talking about, if you believe the DoD, 32 overlapping blanket coverage satellites They should be covering everything, and yet there's 3 oceans, the Southern Atlantic, the Southern Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. You can look it up on yourself in different plane trackers. Those planes, when they get out of ground radar range, land-based radar range, which is the old Loran system, once they get out of that range, blink, they are gone. And they do not come back until they get within land radar range of the continent they're talking about. So anyway, let's circle around because we go to a whole bunch of different points. So Antarctica, once they figured out that the outer edge, they basically confirmed what they already knew, what they were looking for 30 years, which was, okay, we're living in a building. We're living in a giant Truman Show. It's like, okay, what do we do? How do we keep this a secret? How would you hide the world? And that's how I kind of got into building the clues. It's like, okay, if I had to hide the world, I would do this, and I would do this, and I would do this, and I'll be darned if they weren't doing exactly that. One of the first things they did was they created NASA in 1958, and they started doing high-altitude atomic weapons testing, the United States and the Soviet Union, for 4 years, from 1958 until 1962. With all they did, every test they did, they fired weapons straight up for no apparent reason. And I knew it was like, okay, because they had to map out, they weren't going to bust through it. They tried to do that in the first 3 shots, which were megaton blasts. And then after that, it was kiloton shots. And they were basically mapping out the arc of this thing, the dimensions of the structure, so that you could eventually, because the only thing you really had to do, the only thing that was most important about faking this thing is you got to fake space travel, to be specific. You've got to be able to convince people that you've gone to space.
All right, well, let's unpick this then. You're doing missile tests and you're firing missiles straight up because you're doing research on what you know is the flat Earth. Surely the reason for doing missile tests and firing them straight up is that if you do missile tests that fire across and along, which Kim Jong-un has recently done, they might hit somebody. So that's why you fire missiles straight up. You're testing your capability. You fire the missile straight up so it comes straight back down, don't you?
Well, again, it's a nice idea, but if I was going to do it, eventually you've got to figure out. I mean, look, it's the first step in an exploration. You've got to map out everything as best you can. And since you can't send planes up high enough, there's no manned aircraft you can go up high enough. You don't want to start killing people. Best thing is just fire rockets with huge payloads and see where they detonate or where they fail. And during the blast, you can kind of gauge where everything is. Again, the angles, the trajectories, because sooner or later, if you're going to fake space, you've got to fire rockets up and arc them over to where they don't hit any part of the structure, which is what they do. If you want to have fun, type in rocket launch or NASA rocket launch time lapse and look at the images. They all arc over. All rockets go over. They lean over and go horizontal very, very quickly into the trajectory, which doesn't make any sense. So they did that from 58 till 62. And then they did 2 things in 1959, though, which absolutely sunk it for me, which was, okay, in 1959, two very important things. One, the Van Allen radiation belts were announced by a NASA employee named Van Allen, who came forward and said, there's lethal bands of radiation, not necessarily a dome structure. It said lethal bands of radiation up there. Nobody should ever go up there, ever. Humans, big warning sign, go away. And then also in 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was put into place. Remember, Antarctica, where Richard Byrd just a few years before said the place is made out of money, everybody go get some. And in 1959, everybody left the ice at the same time, unilaterally. Nobody complained, nobody protested, everybody left. There was only like 12 nations, I think, at the time, 11 or 12. And they signed a treaty saying nobody can ever set up shop in Antarctica to do anything from a resource standpoint, ever.
Wasn't that because it was a pristine and is a pristine and highly sensitive and delicate environment, and everybody agreed that it was?
Not 1959 it wasn't. 1959, environmentalism wasn't even a word. Greenpeace wasn't even founded until the 1970s, and that was just a couple guys in time.
I definitely concede that point. It is a 1970s phenomenon. So you're saying that? Did you say a dozen nations signed that treaty?
A dozen nations signed it in that. Everyone that was down there.
That means a dozen nations are in on it.
Well, though, no, because you don't have to, at the highest levels, remember, some people really rubs in the wrong way and say, well, you're talking about a conspiracy where millions and millions and millions of people have to know. I'm going, no. This is need to know only. This is compartmentalization, meaning all you have to do is have the first big countries go along with it and talk to just a handful of people, the leaders or whatever, saying, look, it's a national security. You can make up whatever story you want, but all you have to do is tell them, it's like, yeah, we need to get off of here as soon as possible. Nobody needs to come back, and that's it. And the treaty became iron. It's the only treaty in the history of mankind which has never ever been broken. It's ironclad, and every country that comes online as an economic power has to sign it. So if you started a country tomorrow, you decided to mine some mineral, and you became an economic power, and all of a sudden this piece of paper would be put in front of your desk and says, oh yeah, by the way, you can't go down to Antarctica. You say, well, for how long? And ever. What are you talking about? Well, I mean, it's not even up for review until 2041. And this is a long-term treaty. And it doesn't matter how much, and that part really bugged me. It's like that raised more than an eyebrow. I'm a big plot line guy. I love good writing. And that's the part that threw it off the rails.
Forgive me for throwing this at you then, Mark. And this is all intriguing, but forgive me for throwing this at you. If they wanted to keep people from getting to know the secret of this being the perimeter fence that keeps us all in, right, that's one thing. But why is the perimeter fence changing? Why are we concerned about the ice breaking up? Why are we concerned about temperature increase and the effect on whatever wildlife there might be down there? Surely, if it was all a model built by somebody, an ecosystem, then it would be constant, but it's not.
Well, the system, human beings do have an impact on the system. And let me address, because your thing kind of has a two-part question to it, which is, for the most part, Antarctica has been out of sight, out of mind. We even left Antarctica off the UN flag. The UN flag has all the countries and continents there, except that Antarctica is notably missing. It's not there on the UN flag, which is really strange. And one of the big reasons is nobody owns Antarctica. The landmass itself is claimed by no one. Literally, it's like, find me another piece of real estate anywhere in the world that is not owned by it, and nobody even contests it. But as far as what you're saying about the ice cap, well, by the way, before the ice cap melting thing, you remember there was that, I don't know how old you are, remember it was that ozone thing. They said, oh yeah, don't go to Antarctica ever because there's a hole in the ozone layer down there. I remember that was from the 80s. And so
which we've been able to, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not a scientist, let me say this, but we've been able to partly address by controlling our use of CFCs.
Yeah. And then as far as the ice breaking up, though, no, I do believe that human beings have an effect on the system, no question. Because remember, if it is a pressurized, enclosed system, human beings, especially with the technology, and I do believe in some of this. I do believe in some sort of climate change. Global warming, yeah, probably, because most of the temperature changes have been to the warm side, and it shouldn't be a big shock because the internal combustion engine, otherwise known as, well, your car, is just a big furnace. That's all it is. You're just burning fuel, and we're burning, there's billions of these things. You multiply, spread all over the place, and they're always going. And sure.
On your model, then, those fumes will stay within the dome.
Yeah, and the dome will try to compensate for it. I mean, we're talking about an automated system that works perfectly, ironically, works perfectly without human beings. But with human beings, it has to compensate. No different than if you brought in a little propane lantern into your car. Right? Well, the car that was always running. Well, your air conditioning system is going to try to compensate for that propane lantern's heat that's in the back seat, depending on where it is. And it's going to do it in a way that the car really doesn't know, even though the cars are getting smarter every day. It's not going to know exactly. It's going to create little hot and cold pockets here and there, and it's going to change the climate system inside that car. And I know it's a simple demonstration, but you kind of see what I'm getting at. Meaning, yeah, we're changing stuff, and there is extreme weather, and it's happening. It's weird all over the place, and there's islands that are slowly disappearing, and there's storms happening where there shouldn't be. But I also think the military has been kind of meddling as well. I believe in the HARP system, and I believe that because weather is just energy transfer, and we've been able to blow out hurricanes for a long time in a crude way. So if we decide to create weather in a certain place, the system is going to compensate and transfer the energy somewhere else, and there's going to be blowback.
I've never been Mr. Cheap Point Scorer, so please don't think I'm trying to do this. As I say, I find what you say fascinating, but you use the phrase global warming. If you don't believe there's a globe, how can you call it global warming?
Yeah. It's because of the conditioning, and that excellent point to bring up. Global, the term global and sphere and ball have been used to describe our world for so long, and it's been in our psyche for so long, which is why people just race against it. Mostly because the globe has been put in your classroom ever since you were in school. I mean, it starts out over here when we're 6 years old. It just sits in the classroom, and it's just this little toy that sits with you for 12 years. I mean, that is amazing conditioning, because you don't even have to reinforce it every day. It's like, oh yeah, this is where you live. This is your home. If the kids absorb that 12 years on this side unchallenged, what do you think is going to happen? When they get out, if somebody goes against it, the first thing is going to be denial. Which I also have to bring up real quick, which is up until NASA was formed, and people say, "Well, you're saying the NASA's fake?" I'm going, no, it's way worse than that. NASA, the only reason NASA was even constructed was to keep this thing under wraps. A little play on words there, because eventually you're going to have to show a picture of the Earth from space. That's the big thing. Remember, the globe model has been around for a long time. The Copernicus model, 500 years or so. Globes have been around for a while, but they're globes that were founded on a little bit of mathematics, a little bit of